A year and a half ago, I made a video responding to Unlearning Economics and his criticisms of Marxist economics. That video still largely holds up, but I feel that another, more general and higher quality video defending Marxist economics from the critics is warranted. So in this video, I'm going to be responding to the various criticisms and critiques that have been lodged against Marxist economics over the years. I'm also going to discuss advancements in Marxist economics in the last few decades, explore crisis theory, and defend the Marxist theory of capitalist crises. And I'm also going to discuss economic planning and defend the feasibility of central planning. This video is going to retread ground I already covered in the Unlearning Economics video, but it will be more general than the Unlearning Economics video, and even where I retread ground, there's going to be new stuff. Before beginning, I want to clarify that this video is going to be more of a general overview. If you really want to get deep into the weeds, and especially on the mathematical side of things, you can read and watch Marxist economists like Paul Cockshott and Anwar Shaikh, and study works like Classical Econophysics. This video is going to be about the fundamentals of Marxist economics and the mistakes and fallacies the critics make. There won't be anything too intense on the mathematical side, I promise. So without any further ado, let's begin. The most basic fundamental question in all of economics is the question of economic value. It's essentially the question of what determines the worth of goods and services in an economy. Why do cars cost more than shoes? Why is a pencil cheaper than a laptop? At any given time, there are millions of products circulating in an economy, fetching at numerous different prices, and what undergirds all this variation in how things are valued? Today, if you take an economics course in just about any university on the planet, you will be taught the theory of marginalism, which holds that the value of commodities is determined by subjective consumer preferences. The subjective theory of value says that a value is set purely by supply and demand, with commodities being valued according to how much utility, quote-unquote, they provide to consumers. But the subjective theory wasn't always the consensus. The first theory of value to be broadly accepted is the labor theory of value, first appearing in the works of the Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun all the way back in the 14th century, and persisting up to the classical economists of the 18th and 19th centuries, most notably Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The labor theory of value would then be taken up in the works of Karl Marx and form the basis of Marxist political economy. The labor theory of value maintains that the value of commodities is determined by socially necessary labor time. This can sound opaque and esoteric, but in fact, it's a rather simple theory. Socially necessary labor time refers to the average amount of time required to produce a commodity. If it takes workers on average 4 hours to produce a computer monitor, then the value of a computer monitor is 4 hours. Some factories may be more sophisticated and take 2 hours to produce a computer monitor, and some factories may be less sophisticated and take 6 hours to produce a computer monitor, but the average is what matters. In this case, the average would be 6 plus 2 equals 8 divided by 2 equals 4 hours. The LTV further stipulates that there exists a close connection between labor values and prices. Labor values and prices should have a close correlation. Cars cost more than shoes, mainly because cars require more labor to produce. This is what the LTV predicts. And indeed, there is strong empirical evidence for the LTV, which I'll discuss later in the video. It should be noted that price and value are not the same thing. They are two distinct concepts, though they have a close association. Value is the fundamental underlying worth of a commodity, while price is a monetary expression of value, but the two can diverge. Price and value are expected to converge when supply and demand are in equilibrium. In conditions of supply-demand imbalance, however, there can be deviations. Supply and demand still matter in the labor theory of value, but they don't determine value on their own. Rather, labor values serve as a kind of gravitation point for prices. Prices are pulled toward their underlying labor values as supply and demand reach equilibrium. There's also a caveat to the LTV, which is that some industries are expected to be exceptions and to have systemically higher price-value deviations. Chiefly, industries which are natural monopolies, like oil, and this is exactly what we observe in the empirical data. Natural monopolies are instead explained by the Ricardian theory of rent, but that's not too relevant for this video. Furthermore, some select industries are just unique. For example, in the housing market, higher price-value deviations are to be expected given how often housing is treated as a speculative asset, with housing often made deliberately scarce. But in general, in the vast majority of industries, there's a close connection between labor values and prices. Now, the question naturally arises of why exactly labor should be the substance of value. The LTV maintains that human labor holds a special place in the production process, so much so that labor is the ultimate yardstick by which most commodities can be compared. But why is labor special? Mainstream economic theory holds that while labor is significant, it's merely one factor of production and isn't special. But the LTV holds that labor is unique and is the only element of production which creates value. This might seem obviously wrong at a very surface glance. Machines, raw materials, and land all contribute to production, so shouldn't they also create value? Well, to understand why labor is special, one needs to think about the actual material process of producing a commodity on a deeper level. On a surface level, it might seem like labor is just one factor of production and nothing special, but this is just plain wrong. To lead into this point, I'll quote from a paper written by Marxist researcher David Zachariah in 2006, which gets to the heart of the question of why labor is special. Social labor is a direct and indirect input to every commodity. Labor is a universal but scarce resource. During any given period of time, there is a limited amount of person hours available in production, which constrains the feasible consumption pattern. This imposes a practical necessity to allocate it in various branches of production in order to meet changing social demands. Thus, determining demand in terms of labor becomes functionally useful in order to organize and allocate labor with some degree of efficiency. The argument for the specialness of labor boils down to this. Human labor is the universal and most fundamental input in just about every production process. It is the ultimate material cost of producing things. The amount of labor available to a society is the ultimate constraint on production. Societies must apportion labor to the different sectors of production to meet their needs and wants. Labor is, as Adam Smith said, the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things. Humans are involved at some level in every production process, and human labor is the most basic and a fundamental cost of producing things. And since labor is the universal and most fundamental input, it only makes sense to value things according to how much labor they require to produce. All the LTV is really saying is that the harder things are to make, the more valuable they are. And humans are involved in every production process due to a quality Marx called abstract labor. Humans are in effect universal machines who can be trained to perform an extremely wide range of tasks. It's not hypothetically impossible for machines to create value, but they would need to replicate human capacities. They would have to be universal machines who can substitute for humans. Such machines may exist someday, but for now, they remain only hypothetical. With all that said, I want to swat away some common misconceptions about the LTV that one will frequently encounter. A very basic misunderstanding is when people neglect that it's not just labor time, but socially necessary or average labor time, which determines value. If the workers in a factory are unusually inefficient, they're not producing more value just because more labor goes into their output. It's average labor time which determines value. That one is pretty easy. Another common attack is the mud pie argument. If I bake a pie made out of mud, it's highly unlikely that anyone will want to buy and eat my mud pie. Hence, it has no value. This therefore proves that value doesn't come from labor, since the labor I put into the mud pie is worthless. But this isn't any kind of zinger, because in the labor theory of value, things need to be useful to have any value at all. They need to have what Marx called use value. They have to fulfill some human need or want. This is a basic precondition and in no way contradicts the LTV. The labor exerted in making the mud pie indeed created no value because a mud pie isn't useful. These arguments boil down to the misconception that the LTV is claiming that labor ontologically creates value. Critics of the LTV often treat a Marxist as if we're saying that labor intrinsically creates value, as if labor has this magical value-creating property, as if the very act of a person moving their muscles and doing purposeful work means they're creating value. But that's not what the LTV claims. What the LTV claims is that value is related to how difficult things are to make on average. Labor creates value not because it just does, not because of some special superpower of human labor, but because of the role of labor in economic production. And not all labor creates value or is equally valuable. The subjective theory of value is the main alternative to the LTV and the mainstream theory of value which nearly all economic students are taught today. The subjective theory, or marginalism, argues that prices are determined by subjective consumer preferences or utility. How much satisfaction consumers derive from a particular commodity. In practice, marginalism maintains that value is set purely by supply and demand, with prices being determined by the intersection of supply and demand curves, which are said to reveal the utility of a commodity. The problem with the subjective theory is very straightforward. It's unfalsifiable, self-referential nonsense. I mean, for one, how do we go about empirically testing the subjective theory? Testing the LTV is straightforward. Ascertain whether average labor time determines the value of output of industries. Labor values are measurable and can be correlated with the value of output. You can also ascertain whether more capital-intensive industries have lower profit rates, as the LTV predicts. The subjective theory, however, has never been subjected to proper empirical tests because there really isn't a way to test it. If you open any university textbook of economics, you will not find any empirical evidence presented for the subjective theory. It's just a sort of a thought experiment and a just-so story, with economists drawing to imaginary curves and calling it a theory. It's pretty silly and unscientific, which begs the question of why the subjective theory is dominant today. The LTV was broadly accepted until the late 19th century, when the subjective theory took hold and the LTV was relegated to the fringes. The standard story is that the subjective theory was simply stronger than the LTV, and that the LTV was discredited by the progress of science. But the problem with this narrative is that no empirical evidence refuting the LTV was ever actually produced. The LTV was critiqued and discredited, quote-unquote, purely by thought experiments, and today it's the LTV and not the subjective theory, which actually has supporting empirical evidence. Yet mainstream economics remains hostile to the LTV, and the subjective theory continues to prevail. The reason for this is very simply ideology. In the middle of the 19th century, Karl Marx pointed out that the logical implications of the labor theory of value were disfavorable to capitalism. If labor was the source of value, then the incomes of the capitalist class were based upon exploitation. Capitalists made their fortunes by extracting surplus value from the working class. This was a politically explosive charge, which gave credence to the ideas of socialist and communist radicals, and the demands of the burgeoning labor movement. The rise of socialism and the labor movement made the economics profession jittery about a theory which ascribed all economic value to labor, and so the LTV fell out of favor. This wasn't necessarily a conscious conspiracy to mislead people. Rather, it was motivated reasoning, an ideological bias which led economists to search for reasons to discredit the LTV and instead pivot to a new theory of value where capitalists have made their profits fair and square and there is no exploitation. But in the process, economics as a field took a gigantic step backwards in terms of a scientific rigor. If you're wondering why, for example, economists are never able to make accurate predictions, it's because mainstream economics doesn't have a scientific understanding of value at its foundation. Hence, the whole edifices of both neoclassical and Keynesian economics are little more than pseudoscience, with economic phenomena as inscrutable to mainstream economics as comets and lunar eclipses were to ancient pre-scientific humans. The labor theory of value is a deeply politically contentious theory because it implies that the incomes of capitalists and landlords are illegitimate. If only labor creates value, then capitalists are appropriating value created by the labor of workers and aren't generating value themselves. Or at the very least, their incomes are greatly out of proportion with how much they actually contribute to society. This is the notion of a surplus value. Capitalists and landlords receive far more in income and wealth than is justified by their actual contributions. This also doesn't just apply to those who neatly fit the category of a capitalist or landlord. A very rich and famous movie star, or a rich and famous YouTuber, or a wealthy lawyer, or a senior engineer at Google, even if most of their income comes from labor rather than ownership, they're still receiving an income wildly out of proportion with the actual value they provide to society. They may be working only, say, 2,000 hours in a year, and yet receiving 10,000 hours, or 50,000 hours, or 100,000 hours in compensation, or something like that. The labor theory of value implies that a fair distribution of income and wealth would be far more egalitarian than what we have now, with income derived from property ownership completely banned, and labor income tied closely to how much work and effort people actually provide to society. This is the essence of socialism. Socialism calls for the collective public ownership of the means of production and land, and payment to people on the basis of objective work and effort. This doesn't mean that people will necessarily receive an income the full value produced by their labor. A surplus will always have to be extracted to maintain society. A socialist state has to raise money to fund infrastructure, education, scientific research, support for children, the elderly, the disabled, etc., and whatever else is in the public good. There also needs to be support for people who don't directly produce value. Societies need teachers, doctors, administrators, and so forth, and they have to be supported by the labor of those who produce value. So socialism isn't about workers claiming the full value produced by their labor. What it does entail is surplus being directed towards supporting society and the public good, rather than being funneled away into private profit. And these social and political implications of the LTV are what make it so disreputable. A common rebuke one will hear to the labor theory of value is the dreaded transformation problem. The transformation problem has long been seen as a fundamental difficulty of Marxist economics, as an issue which undermines the validity of the LTV and renders labor values irrelevant to understanding real economies. However, those still arguing this are out of step with the latest developments. But first, what even is the transformation problem? I sometimes find critics of Marxism wholly misunderstanding what the transformation problem even is. Like, for example, on learning economics, as I discussed in my video responding to him, there's a misconception that the transformation problem is simply about converting labor values into prices. However, this isn't actually what the transformation problem is. To understand what it actually is, we have to go back to the classical economists with whom the problem first originated. Going back to Adam Smith, the classical economists believed that labor was the source of value. However, they simultaneously believed something else about capitalist economies, which would come to cause significant theoretical issues. The idea that profit rates equalize across sectors. The basic idea is that sectors which are more profitable will attract more investment. Capitalists from other less profitable sectors will move into the more profitable sectors. As capitalists move into a more profitable sector, the resulting investment into the more profitable sector will result in oversupply of that sector's output, causing prices to fall until that sector makes only average profits. So, for example, if producing bionicles is really exceptionally profitable, the idea is that capitalists making, say, batteries or computers or furniture will withdraw/convert their capital and instead shift to making bionicles until the resulting oversupply of bionicles brings the price down and bionicles are no longer uniquely profitable to make. This is what the classical economists and later Marx believed, and it makes some logical sense. If capitalists are generally always seeking maximum profits, then it makes sense that capitalists will tend to move into more profitable industries. However, there was an issue with this theory. Profit rate equalization stood in tension with the labor theory of value. If labor was the substance of value and prices were undergirded by labor values, that implied a wide dispersion of profit rates. More capital-intensive industries will be less profitable, while more labor-intensive industries will be more profitable. But if profit rates in fact equalized, that's a bit of a conundrum. Do labor values still undergird prices if profit rates equalize? What role does labor actually have? If profit rates equalize, that implies prices in fact trend toward a profit rate equalizing prices, rather than being proportional to labor values. So how do these two concepts, profit rate equalization and labor values, gel with each other? How does one convert labor values into profit rate equalizing prices? This was the transformation problem. The transformation problem was a core difficulty with Marxist economics for over a century. There was a vast literature generated on the transformation problem and its potential solutions, and no one could come up with a satisfactory solution. Bourgeois economists pounced on the transformation problem to attack the LTV, and the transformation problem came to be widely seen as a fatal flaw of the LTV. The answer, however, would take shape in the 1980s. One small detail is that during this period, from the late 19th to the late 20th centuries, no one had actually demonstrated empirically that profit rates equalize. It was a widely held assumption, but it had never actually been shown to occur in practice. In 1983, two Marxist mathematicians, Emmanuel Farjan and Moshe Machover, took the leap and argued that profit rate equalization was an unrealistic assumption, and the simple labor theory of value, which implies differential profit rates, is correct. They argued that the transformation problem was in fact entirely moot. Profit rates don't equalize, so there was no need to convert labor values into profit rate equalizing prices. And beginning in the 1990s, empirical evidence would pile up that profit rates indeed don't equalize across sectors, and that more capital-intensive industries have lower profit rates. So there was no actual practical need to reconcile labor values with profit rate equalization, because profit rate equalization doesn't actually occur. The idea of profit rate equalization does make logical sense. As I said, capitalists are always chasing higher profits, so it makes sense that if they see an industry with an exceptionally high profit rate, they would feel compelled to move into said industry. However, while this impulse arguably does exist among capitalists, there are severe practical barriers. A capitalist whose factories are churning out cars can't just convert their capital stock to make something else, like furniture or computers. Machinery is tailored to particular production processes, and a machine which bolts cars together can't be used in another production process. Shifting to another industry usually means discarding and replacing your entire capital stock, and most capitalists will be pretty hesitant to just discard their entire existing capital stock to make the leap into another industry, and so will their investors. Furthermore, there's also the issue of intellectual property rights. Apple, for example, is one of the most profitable companies on earth, but other companies can just decide to shift to making iPhones. They don't have a license to produce iPhones. The iPhone is Apple's intellectual property, and intellectual property rights and laws are widespread. Companies patent their inventions. It's part of the legal framework of capitalist societies. So that presents another major barrier to this hypothetical profit rate equalization mechanism. It's a theory which makes sense in the abstract, but it doesn't manifest in the real world because there are practical limitations on the drive for maximum profit. So ultimately, since profit rates don't equalize, there's no need to transform labor values into profit rate equalizing prices. However, it should be noted that the transformation problem is still a bit controversial among Marxists. Marxist computer scientist Ian Wright, for example, argues that the transformation problem is still a relevant theoretical issue and has presented his own solution. Anwar Sheikh and others argue that while sectoral profit rates don't equalize, regulating profit rates equalize. That's a whole other discussion, but essentially, regulating profit rates refers to the profit rates obtained by firms with the lowest reproducible costs in a particular industry. The idea is that when the regulating profit rate in an industry is higher than those of other industries, firms from other industries will move into the industry with a higher regulating profit rate and adopt the techniques of the regulating firm. This leads to an equalization not of average but regulating profit rates. Paul Cockshott has critiqued this idea, but Victor Magarino has fired back and defended the theory of regulating capitals. Personally, to be entirely frank, I currently don't have a definitive opinion on these deeper controversies. However, the practical implications of the LTV remain largely unaffected by these deeper controversies. I want to circle back to Farjan and Macover because their 1983 book, Laws of Chaos, was actually a very pivotal moment in the development of Marxist economics. Laws of Chaos was really the beginning of Marxist econophysics, a form of Marxist economics which borrows methods from physics and statistical mechanics in the study of political economy. Farjan and Macover argue that the study of political economy should be through a stochastic rather than deterministic lens. And to explain what exactly they mean, I'll use an analogy with physics. Econophysics begins from the observation that capitalist economies are a lot like gas particles entrapped in a closed system. In such a system, gas particles are constantly moving about, interacting and exchanging energy in a highly chaotic fashion. Despite the chaotic nature of the system, the behavior of the gas particles can still be described and understood in aggregate statistical terms. It's difficult to predict and say much about the behavior of any one individual gas particle, but we can make statements about aggregate behavior using statistical mechanics. For example, we know that as time progresses and the entropy in the system rises, the distribution of energy among the gas particles trends toward a Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution, with a minority of gas particles possessing most of the energy, and most gas particles possessing little to no energy. A capitalist economy is actually very comparable. In a capitalist economy, there are millions of people and firms constantly interacting and exchanging money in a chaotic fashion, in a relatively closed system, with people and firms being analogous to gas particles, and money being analogous to energy. By applying statistical mechanics to the study of capitalist economies, Farjan and Macover derived that profit rates should have a gamma distribution rather than a uniform spread, and empirical evidence has indeed found that this is the case. The stochastic approach was able to break through the century-long quagmire Marxist economics had been in, where a more rigid, deterministic idea of capitalism had prevailed, which formed the conceptual backdrop behind the notion that profit rates equalize across sectors. And the use of statistical mechanics to understand capitalist economies has since been extended, especially in the 2004 paper, The Social Architecture of Capitalism by Ian Wright, where he demonstrates that statistical mechanics is able to predict countless features of the capitalist economy. I strongly recommend this 2019 lecture he gave on the subject. Since the 1990s, there have been many empirical studies which lend credence to the labor theory of value. The bulk of these studies use input-output tables to show a very high correlation between socially necessary labor time, including both direct and indirect labor inputs, and the value of output of industries, generally in the ballpark of around 95%. No other input correlates as strongly as labor, and the correlation has been demonstrated far and wide for numerous countries. Furthermore, industries which are more capital intensive have lower profit rates, which is another prediction of the LTV. However, there are those who object to this empirical evidence and maintain that these empirical studies are invalid. There's a general nexus of arguments which crop up over and over again. These arguments can be summarized as thus: 1. The empirical studies are circular. 2. The correlations are spurious. And 3. The correlations are insufficient because the data is too aggregated. The refutations of the empirical evidence that I have encountered all use variants of one or more of these arguments. So first, let's tackle the easiest argument, which is that the empirical studies are circular. This is an argument you sometimes see, such as by the sociologists Simpson Bitchler and Jonathan Nitzan in their book Capital as Power. It's also an argument used by Unlearning Economics in his video on value, which draws heavily from Bitchler and Nitzan.
We are coming back to the same problem we had with marginal productivity theory. We have no measure of the exchange value other than the market. Do people pay for it, and if so, how much? We also have no measure of the value of socially necessary labor time other than wages. We're back to the circularity of theories which attempt to explain prices via prices.
The argument here is that the empirical studies are worthless because they merely correlate prices with prices. The empirical studies measure labor values using aggregate wage bills, and then correlate these wage bills with the value of output of industries. But since labor is obviously a cost of production, it's reasonable to think that industries with higher wage bills would charge higher prices, even if labor isn't the sole source of value. Hence, the empirical studies are circular and don't demonstrate solid evidence for the LTV. Except the problem here is that the empirical studies don't do that. Most of the empirical studies do use wage bills, but they deflate the aggregate wage bills by hourly wage rates to get an approximation of socially necessary labor time. They don't just correlate aggregate wage bills with the value of output. Furthermore, we do have a study which correlates labor values with prices directly from 2004, where David Zachariah used Swedish input-output tables which had direct labor time figures, and found a 97% correlation between labor values and the value of output. So this argument is based on a basic misunderstanding of the empirical studies. Then the second argument charges that the correlations obtained in the empirical studies are spurious. There may indeed be a very high 95% plus correlation between labor values and prices, but the correlation is spurious and being driven by an additional underlying variable or variables. Now, spurious correlation is indeed a threat in science. Correlation indeed doesn't equal causation. Correlations can be driven not because two variables are causally connected, but because of an underlying third variable or multiple underlying variables. But if you have a strong, consistent correlation which fits the prediction of a scientific theory, then you can't just throw your hands up and declare that the correlation must be spurious. You have to demonstrate what is driving the spuriousness. Those arguing that the correlations between labor values and prices are spurious have only ever really proposed one superficially plausible idea, and that's industry size. This argument was first advanced by Andrew Kleeman, a self-described Marxist economist who rejects the labor theory of value and instead promotes his own pet interpretation of value theory. The argument is that since bigger industries, quote-unquote, employ more people, but also have a higher output, you get a spurious correlation between socially necessary labor time and prices. Industry size influences both the total labor employed and the value of output, driving a correlation which is entirely spurious. This might seem plausible at first, but I called this argument merely superficially plausible for a reason. When you think about it critically for more than a few moments, you realize that it doesn't actually make much sense. It's totally conceptually confused. Because for one, what on earth is industry size exactly? What makes an industry big? Is it the actual physical space it takes up? Do you mean how much electricity it uses? What exactly is being referred to? You can't say that it's total labor employed, because that's labor values, and that's one of the variables you're correlating. Nor can you use the value of output, since that's the other variable you're correlating. So what is being referred to here? Kleeman proposes that industry size be defined by costs. The more costs incurred by an industry, the bigger it is. And Kleeman shows that if you control for costs, then the correlation between labor values and prices disappears. But there's a very simple problem with using costs, which is that costs are in fact the mediating variable between labor values and prices. Capitalists make decisions on the basis of costs. Costs contain information about labor content. It's absurd to say control for costs, then the correlation goes away. Kleeman is, as Cockshott says, dividing through the signal to leave the noise. Another potential measurement of industry size is proposed by Bichler and Nitzan in this Excel spreadsheet from 2010, where they purport to show the potential of spurious correlation if industry size is defined as the number of units of output of an industry. Here, they multiply unit price and unit value by output and demonstrate that when you do this, a spurious correlation between labor values and prices appears. However, as Cockshott and co-authors pointed out in 2014, this spreadsheet contains a simple math error. To perform this correlation, you would have to add unit prices together and unit values together, but you cannot do this because these aren't dimensionally homogeneous variables.
Cockshott's error is actually pretty simple. Birchler and Nitzan argue that the correlation can appear just because both the labour value and output are correlated with the size of a given sector. Here we have a spreadsheet they use to illustrate the problem. There are 20 sectors and each produces a different level of output. The level of output is higher as you go down the spreadsheet. Each sector also has a price for its type of output. But in this example, the prices and the labour values are generated independently, so they are not correlated, and you can see this clearly in graph 1, which plots them against each other and finds no relationship. Now what Cockshott does is compares the total output of a sector to the total value of that output, which he measures in labour time. But both of these are obtained by multiplying price or value by output Q. Now what this does, multiplying by a common factor, is that it induces a spurious correlation. You have total price versus total value in graph 3, and you can see that there is indeed a correlation.
So I want to explain what exactly the issue is with this spreadsheet. So this is how you would calculate the correlation between unit prices and unit values. So this is unit price, and this is unit value. So to get these, you would have to add up all of these, and then divide by the number of them. So it would be $0.7 plus $3.1 plus $5.7 divided by the number of them, so it would be divided by 20. But the problem is that in reality, these numbers aren't dimensionally homogeneous. In reality, it would be $0.7 per, say, pencil, plus $3.1 per barrel of oil, though the oil industry works a little differently, but whatever, plus $5.7 per bionicle, etc., etc. But in reality, these numbers aren't dimensionally consistent, and you can't do this correlation. The kind of correlation Bichler and Nitzan are trying to do here is impossible. The argument in this spreadsheet is nonsensical. Hypothetically, if you had fully disaggregated data, you could do a correlation between unit price and unit concrete labor time within a single industry. Though at that point, you wouldn't be testing the LTV anymore, because the LTV says that socially necessary labor time, not direct concrete labor time, correlates with value. But you cannot do such a unit-level correlation across industries because it would be dimensionally invalid. The whole concept of an economy-wide unit price and unit labor value correlation is illogical and meaningless. Excel lets the regression run because Excel doesn't know what these numbers represent and presumes that these variables are dimensionally homogeneous. In a recent Medium article, Unlearning Economics responds to Cockshot and demonstrates that he doesn't understand what Cockshot is saying. Cockshot claims that you can only correlate two variables if they have the same dimensions. He then claims that prices themselves do not have the same dimensions, since the price of a pencil is dollars per pencil and the price of oil is dollars per oil. Only when you multiply them by quantities do you eliminate this problem and get only dollars. Hence the industry level correlations, which pass the test of dimensionality. This is a very strange reply because statistical analysis frequently correlates/regresses things which are incommensurable, like years of education and money wages. This is a pretty rudimentary misunderstanding. Of course, you can correlate incommensurable variables like years of education and money wages, because years of education and money wages are dimensionally homogeneous variables. The point Cockshot is making is that unit price and unit value are not dimensionally homogeneous variables, so this spreadsheet by Bichler and Nitzan makes no sense. So, beyond these two arguments of defining industry size by costs and the impossible correlation, critics of the LTV fall back on the argument that the correlation could be spurious and Marxists haven't demonstrated causality. This is an argument I've seen pretty widely. Unlearning Economics makes this argument in his video on value. He also cites an article by Blair Fix, a protege of Bichler and Nitzan in the Capital as Power School, who also makes this argument. The Spanish-Austrian economist Juan Rallo also more or less repeats this argument in his book Anti-Marx. There are two aspects to this "it could be spurious" argument. One, that it's easy to come up with alternative explanations for the empirical data. And two, and this leads into the third overall argument, that the empirical studies use data which is too aggregated, and that a third underlying variable, or more, is being concealed by the aggregation. To the first argument, it's true that one can come up with any manifold of alternative explanations for the empirical data. However, this is totally ordinary because you can always think of alternative explanations for an observation. In the case of a correlation between two variables, no matter how strong the evidence is for a causal connection, you can always suggest that there's some underlying variable or variables driving spuriousness. You can always come up with alternative explanations, an alternative framework for explaining the data. But unless you produce evidence, no one is obliged to take you seriously. And the same goes to Juan Rallo, who argues that the third underlying variable driving spuriousness is utility, which is all well and nice, but you have to produce evidence to back up that assertion, and Rallo, of course, doesn't. In his Medium article, Unlearning Economics writes, "My view is that these correlations show that labor is a factor of production, but my view is also that production is a complex combination of various factor inputs, and labor is not special among them." And I want to cite Cockshot responding to this in a blog post. He says, Okay, what are these a complex combination of factors? What are the factors? He doesn't seem to consider that in the work that I and many others have done, we consider all the inputs into the production process that are listed in the national input-output tables. That is to say, for each production process, we take into account of the order of 100 inputs. But the point is that in the classical labor theory of value, as set out by Ricardo, you can decompose all of these inputs into the labor that was required to produce them. Indeed, on learning economics, what is this a complex combination of factors? What are Cockshott, Cottrell, Zachariah, etc. missing? What is being unaccounted for in the empirical studies? Until you elaborate and until you provide empirical evidence of backing up your assertions, you don't have any leg to stand on. And then finally, we get to the argument about aggregation versus disaggregation, which is related to the spurious correlation argument. It has often been argued that the empirical studies are invalid because they correlate labor values and prices at highly aggregated levels. To truly produce a strong empirical evidence for the LTV, it is claimed, Marxists have to show that this correlation persists at more disaggregated levels. If the correlation weakens or disappears at more disaggregated levels, well, then the more aggregated correlations must be spurious. Sometimes, critics of Marxist economics frame this by saying that Marxists have to demonstrate that a unit-level correlation between labor values and prices exists. But this is a conceptual confusion. As I've already mentioned, the concept of an economy-wide correlation between unit prices and unit labor values makes no sense. And if you correlate a unit price with unit concrete labor time within a single sector, then you wouldn't be testing the LTV anymore. By the very nature of the theory, we need to do sectoral correlations. It's average labor time, which determines average price. However, there's another version of the aggregation versus disaggregation argument which makes more logical sense, which is that Marxists need to demonstrate that the correlation holds up when you decompose the data into more and more industries. Most empirical studies of the LTV use highly aggregated data, but you can break down these sectors into smaller and smaller sectors, which contribute to the overall output of the more aggregated sectors. The idea is that if the correlation weakens and breaks down at more disaggregated sectoral correlations, then this suggests spuriousness in the more aggregated sectoral correlations. The problem, though, is that this argument is false. It is actually wholly possible for the correlation to get weaker at more disaggregated levels, and for the more aggregated correlations to still be valid. For one, it's a socially necessary labor time, including both direct and indirect labor inputs, which determines value, and hence, the signal becomes stronger the more the data is aggregated. As you disaggregate the data into more and more sectors, there's less mixing and averaging between the labor of different sectors, and so the correlation is inevitably going to become weaker. In fact, the persistence of price-value deviations is actually integral to the functioning of a capitalist economy. Price-value deviations, according to supply and demand, provide a vital information. If a commodity is selling poorly, firms will inevitably mark the price down, and that serves as a signal for capitalists to withdraw and avoid investment in said commodity, while if a commodity is selling well, capitalists will mark up the price, which serves as a signal for capitalists to invest more in said commodity. These deviations are persistent and necessary, but they balance each other out at more aggregated levels. In more disaggregated data, however, these deviations are going to weaken the relationship between labor value and price. So no, demonstrating that the correlation weakens at more disaggregated levels doesn't prove spuriousness. The only way to prove spuriousness is to demonstrate what is causing the spuriousness. Additionally, Juan Rollo in Anti-Marx cites a study by Andre Vanoa, which claims to show that when one studies the correlation between labor values and prices across sectors, across different countries over time, the correlation disappears. If instead of studying the correlation between market prices and direct prices in the various industries of a single country for a single period, cross-sectional data. We study this correlation in the various industries of different countries over the years using panel data. Then the correlation disappears. In particular, Vanoa 2014, using a different method of estimating values from Shake or Cockshott and Cottrell, analyzes various OECD countries in different periods ranging from 1970 to 2009, and rejects the hypothesis that direct prices determine market prices with a 5% level of significance. However, you'll notice that Rallo mentions that Vanoa used a different method for estimating labor values in his study. When one looks at the paper, the method Vanoa uses follows our old friend, Andrew Kleeman, and Kleeman's method involves treating costs as a potential driver of a spurious correlation. Vanoa is measuring labor values in a completely erroneous way, which involves deflating costs. Rallo then cites another study, which also uses panel data across many countries, but which still finds a strong correlation between labor values and prices, in contrast to Vanoa, because the authors don't borrow their methodology from Kleeman. Rallo points out, however, that the correlation is weaker and argues that this suggests spuriousness in the cross-sectional studies, and that labor is just one factor influencing the value of output. However, this panel data is much larger and more disaggregated. The authors are looking at an enormous dataset consisting of over 36,000 price vectors, so the weaker correlation is unsurprising and entirely in line with the labor theory of value. Rallo points out that the authors find higher deviations between labor values and prices the more they disaggregate the data, but again, this is entirely consistent with the LTV. Once again, the correlations being weaker at more disaggregated levels is not proof of spuriousness. There's no substitute for actually demonstrating what is driving the spuriousness. This argument by insinuation is fallacious. To Rallo's small credit, he doesn't just throw his hands up and gesture towards some complex combination of factors, but suggests utility is the underlying variable driving spuriousness. But in the absence of any empirical evidence, or even any way of actually measuring utility, he doesn't have a leg to stand on either. I want to address another argument against Marxist economics and socialism in general, which is more of a sociological than economic argument, but nevertheless, I still think it's important to address. Part of the ideological superstructure of a capitalist society is the idea that inequalities of wealth and income simply reflect natural differences in intelligence, talent, and hard work between people, that there's nothing unfair or unjust about the levels of economic inequality we observe in a capitalist society. The working class isn't being screwed over or exploited. Workers are just naturally less intelligent and gifted, while the rich earn their wealth through their talents. Marxist econophysics has something to say about this claim. Back in 2000, two econophysicists, Victor Yakovenko and Adrian Dragulescu, published a paper called The Statistical Mechanics of Money, which analyzed the income distribution in capitalist societies using statistical mechanics. Yakovenko and Dragulescu predicted that income in capitalist societies should follow a Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution, just like the distribution of energy among gas particles in a closed system. When they compared their prediction to the empirical data, they found that income in the USA followed a Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution beneath a power law. For around 95% of the population, income follows a Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution, and as you reach the top 5%, the distribution becomes even more unequal and turns into a power law. The simple analogy to gas particles in a closed system was able to explain the distribution of income for 95% of the population. And in regard to the power law for the top 5%, Ian Wright was able to explain this in The Social Architecture of Capitalism. Yakovenko and Dragulescu assumed a capitalist economy which abided by what Marx would call simple commodity production, where people exchange commodities, but there is no buying and selling of labor power. Essentially, the original paper didn't include the exploitation of labor by the capitalist class. When this is factored in, the power law for the top 5% appears, making the income distribution even more radically unequal. Marxist econophysics is able to explain the income distribution, and the political implications of this are pretty monumental. This research implies that the income distribution has little to do with things like intelligence and hard work, and that there's nothing special about rich people, and no reason to think that they have genes for higher intelligence or whatever. Econophysics implies that even if everyone in a capitalist economy starts off with exactly the same amount of money, and everybody is equally intelligent and hardworking, an astronomical degree of inequality will still develop simply because markets maximize entropy. A fundamental question about capitalism is the issue of what causes capitalist crises. Everyone can observe that capitalism goes through reoccurring crises of varying degrees of severity, the most well-known being the Great Depression of the 1930s and 40s, and the Great Recession. But there was also the Long Depression of the 1870s to 90s, and there was also a depression in the 1830s and 40s, and there was also the Great Stagflation from the 1970s to 90s. It's not an exaggeration to say that mainstream economists have no idea what causes these movements, whether it's the shorter business cycle or the longer-term tendency for major crises to periodically arise in capitalism. Neoclassical economists usually hand-wave away the problem and claim that there are no consistent endogenous mechanisms generating crises in capitalism. The business cycle and the occasional severe depression are just a result of random shocks to the system. This is the result of ideological impetus. If there is some endogenous mechanism generating periodic crises in capitalism, then that undermines liberal claims about capitalism being the highest and most advanced economic system. Beginning in the 1930s, amidst the catastrophe of the Great Depression, a new theory of capitalist crises emerged, put forward by the ascendant Keynesian school. Keynesians argued that there was indeed an endogenous mechanism which generated capitalist crises, relating to deficiencies in aggregate demand. The idea was that aggregate demand, the total demand for goods and services within the economy, was the key variable for the health of a capitalist economy. If aggregate demand was too low, then the diminished spending in the economy would create a slump, where businesses aren't able to sell their output, where capitalists pull back on investment because there's less demand. The economy retracts, businesses shutter, people lose their jobs, and economic progress stops, all because of diminished spending. Hence, government policy needs to prop up spending, and in doing so, capitalist crises will be resolved. John Maynard Keynes himself never talked about such things as strengthening labor unions or expanding the welfare state, and in fact, he was quite politically conservative. He attributed these shifts in aggregate demand to sudden irrational movements of animal spirits in capitalists and consumers. However, Keynes's ideas would soon be interpreted as lending credence to the policy goals of progressive and social democratic reformers of capitalism, and it's easy to see why. If maintaining aggregate demand is of the highest importance, then it makes sense to ensure that workers have healthy incomes. Hence, it makes sense to support strong labor unions, and to ensure that workers have a strong social safety net so that no one slips through the cracks. It also makes sense to support full employment, since unemployed people aren't making any income to spend. The Keynesian theory amounts to saying that capitalist crises are the product of a mere technical defect of capitalism, which can be managed with studious economic policy. There's no need to abolish capitalism to end crises, and in fact, capitalism is actually better off being managed by Keynesians. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can have rising wages, healthy profits, and economic and technological progress all at the same time, indefinitely, with no necessary trade-offs. The capitalist drive for maximum profit with no regard for the human consequences is actually counterproductive for capitalism. This is why I like to call Keynesianism progressive bourgeois economics. It's bourgeois economics in the sense that it's trying to preserve a capitalism, but it does so by arguing that embracing pro-worker policies and that continually investing in the productive forces of society is actually in the interests of capitalism. It's a nice story, and it's one which was broadly accepted by economists and policymakers in the Western world for a few decades after the Great Depression, but it came crashing down beginning in the 1970s when the capitalist world descended into another crisis. The crisis quickly discredited Keynesian theory among economists and policymakers. Western capitalist economies were operating at near full employment, labor unions were strong, and workers' wages had been rising vigorously for decades. And yet here was another crisis. The thing which Keynesian policy was supposed to extinguish. Stagflation, rising unemployment, and inflation simultaneously was ravaging Western economies. Even though Keynesian theory predicted that such a thing should be impossible, it was at this moment that neoclassical economists stepped in and offered a solution. Neoliberal economics based upon crushing labor unions, lowering taxes on the rich and the private sector, privatizing public industry, and no longer making full employment a policy objective. Persuaded by these arguments, economists and policymakers throughout the Western world pivoted to neoliberal policy at varying times. The advanced capitalist economies abandoned progressive bourgeois economics and returned to conservative bourgeois economics. We've seen that both neoclassical and Keynesian economics have been totally unable to explain, let alone predict, capitalist crises, which leaves us with the Marxist theory of capitalist crises, which is based on the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, aka the TRPF. The TRPF is based on the labor theory of value and makes the logical deduction that since only labor creates value, the accumulation of the capital stock in excess of the growth of the labor force should cause the rate of profit to decline. In more technical terms, Marxist theory hypothesizes that as the organic composition of capital, the ratio of the value of the capital stock to the value of labor power used in production rises, the rate of profit should fall. Capital cannot create value. So the more capital intensive the overall capitalist economy becomes, the less surplus value there is for capitalists to extract. The TRPF predicts that the capital stock will grow faster than the labor force in the long run, and hence the rate of profit will fall. There are ways for capitalists to combat the falling rate of profit. If the rate of exploitation, the rate at which capitalists extract a surplus value from workers, increases, then that will counter the effect of capital accumulation. Another way is through technological change. If a technological innovation reduces the value of the capital stock by decreasing the average labor time required to produce the capital stock, then that will also counteract the TRPF. And another way is to simply slow down or even stop accumulating altogether. It should be noted that there are actually two interpretations of the TRPF, and these two interpretations sometimes get mixed together. One interpretation of the TRPF is based upon a technical change. If rising labor productivity reduces the value of commodities, that should lead to falling prices, and falling prices should reduce profitability for capitalists. This idea is indeed found in Marx's work, and it's a popular interpretation of the TRPF, but there's a problem with it. Rising labor productivity also happens in the sectors producing capital goods. Rising labor productivity can also cheapen the capital stock, offsetting or outweighing the effect of falling prices elsewhere. So this idea is dubious. A second interpretation of the TRPF, and the one I have been expounding on in this section, conceives of the TRPF as being driven by the long-run accumulation of the capital stock of society. This is the interpretation which Marx ultimately lands on in Capital, and we can confidently say that this interpretation is correct because it's the one supported by the empirical evidence. There is a fair amount of empirical evidence for the TRPF put forward by different Marxist scholars. I think the strongest evidence so far comes from the work of Paul Cockshott and Alan Cottrell. The other empirical studies are perfectly valid, but what gives the findings of Cockshott and Cottrell additional strength is that they model predictions to data. They construct a model of the TRPF and test its predictions to the actual data for many countries, and they find a close correspondence. As the organic composition of capital rises, the average rate of profit falls, and this can explain capitalist crises, with crisis periods being associated with steep drops in the rate of profit. So the TRPF is well supported by the empirical evidence. However, there is an issue with the empirical studies, which I want to highlight, though this issue doesn't undermine their basic validity. That concerns the question of how to measure the capital stock. Nearly all the empirical studies simply use the value of the capital stock, but there's a case to be made that this isn't the most accurate way to do it. I want to give credit to the writer Nicholas Villarreal for highlighting this in a blog post. There's a good argument that the capital stock should actually be measured by depreciation. Capital stock is constantly worn down and degraded by use and has to be replaced at regular intervals. And the more capital accumulates, the more labor has to be devoted to replacing and maintaining the capital stock. From the perspective of a capitalist, this is why a rising organic composition of capital reduces profitability. They have to spend more of their revenue on replacing and maintaining the capital stock. The higher the value of the capital stock, the more expensive it is to maintain the capital stock. And that's bad for profitability because capital doesn't create value. It makes more sense to measure the capital stock by depreciation. It gets to the heart of fundamentally why the rate of profit declines as the organic composition of capital rises. And as Villarreal points out, it's more consistent to use depreciation rather than the value of the capital stock. Profit and wages are income categories, but the value of the capital stock is an asset category. So replacing it with depreciation, an income category, makes sense. That being said, the empirical studies which I have cited are still valid. The value of the capital stock is correlated with depreciation costs, so it's an approximation. However, it's probably more accurate to use depreciation. The labor theory of value is contentious because of its political and social implications, and one of those implications concerns the viability and desirability of economic planning. Today, the overwhelming consensus, both between mainstream neoclassical economists and Keynesian economists, is that economic planning is inferior to the market, a position which seems to have been confirmed by the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But contemporary Marxist economics implies that while the Soviet system may have collapsed, economic planning as a concept is both feasible and desirable as a way of eliminating the inequalities and instabilities associated with market economies. The most common and obvious argument is that central planning is simply computationally infeasible. This argument was made most prominently by the Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who argued that no central planning authority could ever possibly hope to keep track of the millions of products across a whole economy and maintain good, up-to-date information at all times. This argument is still often made by liberals and liberal economists, but in our age of computing and information technology, it's a bit of a silly argument to still be making. In the USSR, Soviet planners could already keep track of around 200,000 products just with the human bureaucrats. Now that is far below the 24 million items produced in the whole Soviet economy by the mid-1980s. But if you have any sense of just how far computing power has come, the idea that keeping track of all items across the economy is intrinsically computationally infeasible is already, on a surface level, implausible. Modern computing technology can augment information processing by many orders of magnitude. So the idea that tracking 24 million products, or 50 million products, or 100 million products is impossible doesn't pass a basic plausibility test, if you ask me. I'll quote a Paul Cockshot to this effect. The general laws of computability and complexity theory cannot be evaded. The preparation of a complete, balanced, and disaggregated plan is Turing computable. Algorithms exist for it, but not everything that is computable in principle is computable in practice. A 5-year plan that takes 50 years to prepare is no good to anyone. Opponents of socialism have made much of the impossible complexity of the millions of equations that would have to be solved. It sounded formidable, but we now solve millions of equations on a routine basis. Weather forecasts involve evaluating the temperature, pressure, and wind velocities for millions of discrete space-time positions. Weather forecasts share with plans the criterion of promptness. It is no good having an algorithm that will forecast tomorrow's weather if it takes 2 days to do the calculations. The key issues here are the complexity of the algorithms and the speed of the computers used. For an algorithm to be tractable, the running time must grow relatively slowly with the problem size. The reason why the millions of equations needed for short-range weather forecasts are tractable lies in the fact that they involve local interactions. Each cubic kilometer of air interacts only with its nearest neighbors. This bounds the complexity involved in solving the equations. We have outlined elsewhere plan balancing algorithms of low complexity. Plans, like weather simulations, are characterized by local interactions. Modern supercomputers could, were they suitably programmed, derive a balanced plan for a major industrial economy as expeditiously as they today predict tomorrow's weather. This removes what has long been a major practical objection to planning. However, it should be said that part of the reason why critics of Marxism insist planning is infeasible is that most are thinking inside of a neoclassical framework. Inside the neoclassical framework, where price is determined purely by subjective consumer preferences, economic planning does sound a lot more intractable. Utility has never even been measured by neoclassical economists. So yeah, the idea of planning an entire economy on the basis of utility does sound pretty intractable. Marginalism, by definition, rules out economic planning because utility can only be revealed by the intersection between two imaginary supply-demand curves, representing the sum of subjective individual preferences. In marginalism, the free market has essentially a magical power to reveal the value of commodities, which can't be replicated by any supercomputer. However, when you understand the problem in terms of labor values, it becomes entirely tractable. When you think in terms of input-output, in terms of organizing social labor, the problem becomes well-defined and simple. Paul Cockshot and Alan Cottrell have done a lot of work on developing a blueprint for central planning on the basis of labor values. This kind of economic planning is sometimes referred to as cybernetic planning. That leaves the question, however, of why Soviet socialism faltered if economic planning is indeed feasible. The reasons are both technical and ideological. On a basic technical level, Soviet socialism was, in a sense, before its time. Political developments outran technological developments, and the USSR simply didn't have the computing technology to keep track of the millions of items across the economy. The planning authorities could keep track of a small proportion, but for the rest, output was set in terms of aggregate targets, rather than detailed economic planning using input-output tables and up-to-date information on consumer demand. Most Soviet industries were simply given these aggregate targets to meet, and for rapid industrialization, this worked very well, allowing the USSR to experience a faster economic growth than almost any other country before or since. Setting simple aggregate targets works well enough when you're building your industrial base. Products like electricity, gas, coal, and steel have little differentiation and an attitude of producing as much electricity, gas, coal, and steel can industrialize your country very rapidly, but after the initial phase of a rapid industrialization, you need a dynamic economy responsive to consumer demand. A significant deficiency of the Soviet system was the lack of consumer feedback. Earlier, I mentioned that on a micro level, price-value deviations are not only persistent but actually necessary for the operation of a capitalist economy. When a commodity is selling above its value, that signals to capitalists to increase investment, and if a commodity is selling below its value, that signals to capitalists to pull back investment. A planned economy has to replicate this mechanism, or else rational planning is impossible. The economy will be unresponsive to consumer demand. The Soviet system of setting simple aggregate targets didn't readily replicate this mechanism, so large imbalances were inevitable. Incorporating this kind of feedback is only possible with the detailed planning, which wasn't technologically feasible in the Soviet Union. So, in other words, Soviet planning wasn't cybernetic. However, as I said, the problems of Soviet socialism weren't entirely technical, they were also ideological. The Soviets lacked the computing power to perform detailed economic planning, but the Soviets still made poor use of the computing power which was available to them, and they placed no special emphasis on developing computing technology to improve the efficiency and rationality of planning. In fact, there was often outright hostility to the concept of cybernetic planning. Why was there a reticence at best and outright hostility at worst to the prospect of cybernetic planning? It can seem a little bizarre today, but it begins to make sense when you consider the prevailing interpretations of what communism meant during the days of classical Marxism. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Marxists widely had a conception of communism as being defined by material abundance. The idea was that communism would come about by the rapid development of the productive forces, to the point where things were so abundant that they could be provided for free on demand. This is based on what I think is a dubious reading of passages from Marx and his famous saying, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." Essentially, Marxists widely interpreted communism as a post-scarcity society where the division of labor would melt away and things could be provided for free. I believe that this is a totally dubious reading of Marx, considering that in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx advocated distribution according to labor credits. However, Marxists were enamored with this idea of post-scarcity communism. It loomed large in the minds of the Marxists of that day, and it led to a very heavy emphasis on the development of the productive forces, with the idea that communism would be achieved by simply rapidly developing the productive forces until things were so abundant that they could be provided for free. And later on, this directly molded the Soviet outlook. Soviet leaders consistently saw increasing economic output as the same thing as progressing toward communism. They had little interest in developing a consumer-oriented economy. They weren't bothered by the lack of cybernetic feedback, and in fact, many saw cybernetics as an inherently bourgeois science. A desire to rapidly industrialize was entirely rational, and especially so for the geopolitically vulnerable USSR. But this attitude was more than simply a desire to rapidly industrialize, but a view of increasing gross output as an end in of itself, because it was thought to be synonymous with communism. This is sometimes called productionism, and it led the Soviets to disregard cybernetics and the need to improve the efficiency and rationality of economic planning. In a sense, you can say that the Soviet leadership never even really thought about how to construct a true political economy of socialism. They wanted to sidestep the issue entirely by leaping straight toward communism, with the idea that this would be achieved simply by expanding gross economic output enough. However, all that said, I do think, despite the problems and deficiencies of the Soviet system, that the system in fact worked better than usually given credit for, even in its later years. The problems of the Soviet system are substantially exaggerated, if you ask me. And the collapse of the USSR and the transition into a market economy was a massive humanitarian catastrophe, but that's a subject for a future video. Alright, before I wrap up this section, I do want to address one more argument against economic planning, which is the supposed superiority of market socialism. It's often argued by those on the right wing of the socialist movement that socialists ought to embrace markets rather than central planning, combining the alleged superior efficiency of markets with worker ownership of the means of production. Market socialists advocate an economy characterized by worker cooperatives competing in a market, and market socialism isn't purely hypothetical, as we do have one example in socialist Yugoslavia. Market socialism would definitely be a major improvement over capitalism. Market socialism abolishes the exploitation of labor by capitalists, with workers instead running their own enterprises and deciding democratically on how to distribute profits. It's a different form of socialism than central planning. In central planning, worker ownership is less at the individual level of enterprises and more at the collective level of society, with every enterprise bound to the plan, while market socialism entails individual worker cooperatives competing in a market just like capitalist businesses do. But it's a kind of a socialism nonetheless. However, while market socialism may be useful as a transitional measure, there's overwhelming reason to think that cybernetic planning would be superior. Abolishing the exploitation of labor isn't enough to do away with all the undesirable effects of a market economy. One such undesirable effect is the level of inequality. Earlier in the video, I explained how econophysics has shed light on the distribution of income in capitalist societies, and the distribution of profit rates as well. Markets maximize entropy, and this leads to a high degree of inequality between individuals and firms, and the same would apply to individuals and cooperatives in a market socialist economy. We can surmise that in a market socialist economy, the distribution of income and the distribution of profit rates between cooperatives will follow a similar course. The distribution of income will be less unequal because the exploitation of labor is abolished, but there is still going to be a high degree of inequality unrelated to differences in talent and intelligence and hard work between people, resulting simply from the market maximizing entropy. This already is undesirable enough. But this is also likely to be politically dangerous for any market or socialist society. The high degree of inequality is likely eventually going to result in pressure to reintroduce wage labor and thus exploitation. Many co-ops will be bankrupt or on the verge of a bankruptcy. There's going to be many people toward the bottom of the income distribution and people who are outright unemployed, willing to work for a wage, and the pressure to allow successful co-ops to provide them with wage work will likely increase over time. Yugoslavia partially addressed this problem by allowing a mass migration of the unemployed, which I think is a less than ideal solution. A planned economy, meanwhile, leads to a much more egalitarian distribution of income and full employment, and eliminating the instabilities and fluctuations inherent to market economies. These days, although there is growing opposition to mainstream neoclassical economics, as the disastrous effects of neoliberal economics have manifested themselves, the overwhelming majority of that opposition does not have a Marxist character. Instead, the vast majority of heterodox economists today fit into the tradition of post-Keynesianism. Today, post-Keynesianism is the most influential economic school among the progressive and labor left. Post-Keynesians are the most visible critics of neoclassical economics, like Isabella Weber, or our old friend Unlearning Economics. And post-Keynesianism informs much of progressive and even socialist policy thinking. The post-Keynesians have carried the mantle of Keynesianism into the 21st century, advocating policies which break from neoliberal orthodoxy, following the old Keynesian argument that the health of capitalist economies is ultimately downstream from aggregate demand. Post-Keynesians have also pioneered a new fashionable idea, modern monetary theory, arguing that governments can't go bankrupt and can just print money to fund consumption and investment. Post-Keynesianism seems to offer a radical departure from neoliberalism, and it's understandable why many on the left find it attractive. The problem, though, is that post-Keynesianism is just wrong. The most obvious defect of post-Keynesianism is that it doesn't have any theory of value. Post-Keynesians reject the labor theory of value. They also reject utility. They just don't have any theory of value at all. As we saw with Unlearning Economics, he just hand waves away the problem and declares that prices are determined by some complex combination of factors without specifying further. And this is emblematic of the general attitude of post-Keynesians. They discourage analysis of capitalism at the level of production, and don't seem to think it's all that important to understand or explain value. Instead, the motions of a capitalist economy are downstream from aggregate demand. So long as you maintain aggregate demand, capitalism will deliver rising living standards, economic and technological progress, and healthy profits indefinitely. But this idea has already been tested and tried and proved to be false. It's why Keynesianism fell out of favor with mainstream economists. Post-Keynesian theory is simply wrong about how capitalism works, so if any left-wing government today were to adopt post-Keynesian prescriptions, the result would be disastrous. This is especially true in light of the growing popularity of a modern monetary theory, which claims that governments can just print money to pay their debt, and hence they can fund capital investment and social welfare by just printing money. This isn't true because while governments issue currency, they don't control its value. Money isn't arbitrary, it isn't just vibes. Money is a representation of labor time. It's connected to the underlying real material economy. When states print money to pay their debt, it just causes a hyperinflation and economic and potentially political collapse. So if any left-wing government were to come to power and follow the prescriptions of MMT, it would be a total catastrophe. MMT is just the latest innovation in Keynesian have your cake and eat it tooism. Capitalism can work for everyone so long as government policy props up aggregate demand, and now, according to MMT, governments don't even need to raise revenue by taxing the rich and the private sector. They can just print the money, which is a ridiculous and dangerous idea. Marxist economics, unlike post-Keynesianism, provides a viable alternative political economy to neoliberalism because it actually understands how political economy works.